Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 40th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things at News from Neptune, bearing in mind Rosa Luxemburg's remark, quote, "The most revolutionary thing you can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." On a mass murder edition, from a concert in Las Vegas to funerals in Yemen, we must stop mass murder, writes Kathy Kelly in an important piece on the Common Dreams website that I recommend, and I will put on the News from Neptune Facebook page as well. Once again, News from Neptune has failed to win the Nobel Peace Prize and join the ranks of mass murderers like Henry Kissinger and Barack Obama. So, injustice again. Nevertheless, we will soldier on, so to speak, with two announcements. One, first, there is an anti-war demonstration tomorrow, if you're listening to us on Friday night. Tomorrow, Saturday, from 2 to 4 p.m. in downtown Champaign. The local anti-war group, AWARE, will be holding its regular monthly anti-war demonstration, street demonstration with the distribution of flyers and information, and we invite people who want to make a public protest about the war making the U.S. is carrying on to join that demonstration. That's Saturday afternoon, 2 to 4 p.m. in downtown Champaign. A second announcement is our usual thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research is in place for this program. Dr. No has been a source of the existence of News from Neptune since radio days, and his notes, his research notes, have been particularly worthwhile and helpful recently, so much so that I'm posting those notes on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. This is not on Facebook. This is a separate blog. Not much used these days, but now a good spot to make these notes available. No's notes, Dr. No's notes on the news of the week will be posted each week or each month, depending upon when I get it together, on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. And our usual thanks to Dr. No. We have a number of things to talk about today, and we'll see first of all what's on David Green's laundry list.
Yeah, well, thanks from me to Dr. No as well, and if you are in downtown Champaign joining us tomorrow, or if you want an incentive to join us, it's Oktoberfest, and our demonstration at 4 o'clock will be followed by the mayor of our fair city, Deb Finan, tapping the first keg. And there'll be free beer and brats. I guess free beer and brats. Maybe you have to pay for it. I really don't know. But, and
no such thing as a free lunch, someone says, right?
I know it's going to be free polka. But anyway, I have 7 things on my list. Okay. The first is just to follow up on what we were talking about as a reading list for the Vietnam War, in response to the Vietnam War series that some people have been watching. I brought in this book, which I did mention last week, Anatomy of a War by Gabriel Kolko, which is certainly arguably the most comprehensive narrative account of that. But I also would recommend something I didn't think to recommend last week. That's Howard Zinn's book of the time in the 1960s, The Logic of Withdrawal, which I think was a very good, concise, ongoing critique of our participation in Vietnam from that era, I believe 67 or 69, I'm not sure. Positive news of the week, I think pretty much as far as I can tell, in a pretty crappy week, revolves around Jeremy Corbyn and the UK, and some pretty positive assessments of the progress that the Labour Party is making at really charting a different course for the United Kingdom in relation, as Leo Panitch was saying on The Real News in an interview we did on the Real News, definitely not socialism in terms of a real socialist like Leo Panitch, but certainly moves to reinsert the government to take exchange value out of the vital services that people need, like healthcare, housing, and so forth. So it's worth, as we tend to get positive about things that are going on of a more sort of spectacular nature, like we did in Greece a couple of years ago. I think what's going on in the UK isn't quite as much of a spectacular nature, but it seems to be an ongoing, genuine takeover of the Labour Party with some qualifications. And John Pilger, I think, has some of those this morning in his column on Counterpunch. But something worth keeping an eye on. And now to all the negative stuff or the critical stuff. I've been critical of Amy Goodman for well over the last year, starting with my criticism of her promotion of a film called The Hunting Ground about sexual assault on college campus. And that actually has moved forward. That critique that I was making then and that other people were making then has moved forward. And I think is a very valid one, and it includes a recent series of articles by a woman named Emily Yoffe at the website of the Atlantic, and I think that's worth following, and as well as just I'm going to take a modest amount of I don't know about the words credit. I think I wrote a good article a year ago, June, about this issue. I got very little response to it, but it seems like common sense. It's become the common sense, even in the liberal New York Times, that people accused of sexual assault, mostly men, should actually have the ability to defend themselves and to be properly charged if they are guilty, or properly exonerated if they're not, according to actual evidence. That's only the background for my current criticism of Amy Goodman, which continues her plunge into identity politics. A couple of interviews this week or a sort of a show-long interview, I guess. I didn't watch the program, but I read the transcripts of her interview with Masha Gessen, the Russian and sort of Putinophobic Russian woman who is writing for the New York Times. Maybe I'm the first one to coin that phrase. I don't know. Probably not. And again, showing Amy Goodman's entertainment of Masha Gessen and her critique of Putin, kind of showing that Amy Goodman buys into the whole Russophobia that's going on. Pretty disturbing stuff. And including on that day yesterday, there was a headline about the Russiagate Facebook business, which they just wrote kind of straightforwardly as if, oh yes, the Russians are interfering. They're doing Facebook posts that created a divisive atmosphere in 2016, and so on and so forth. Amy Goodman just reporting these headlines as if, yeah, we all understand by now that the Russians are no good and they interfered with things and so forth. And even in relation back to Russia, for my fifth point, if you're counting, Cuba, the whole business of the people driven, the people, alleged people being made sick, U.S. Foreign Service officers being made sick in Cuba, allegedly by Cuba. The New York Times had an article about this, and when you looked at the comments on the side, the first about 10 comments were saying, well, everybody knows that Russia must be doing this. It was like, yeah, Russia's making people sick. Russia's just everything, And so two more things. One is an article that I posted on the Aware Discuss list this morning from this morning's News Gazette about a program I guess I didn't really understand what the Internet of Things is until I read that, and it was explained to me that you're going to like program it at the most basic level. It's like using your computer to I guess turn your coffee on or something, but at a more refined level, it's using computers to kill people without actual people, and which is what drones are already doing. But unless you need people to actually fly those drones from the Creech Air Force Base near where a bunch of people got murdered in Nevada a few days ago. But regardless of this, our campus is proud of the fact that we're part of this consortium of engineering and computer science programs that's developing this technology to have this Internet of Things to fight our wars, always reminding us of the idea, the old neutron bomb, idea that you kill the people without. It's kind of the reverse of that. You kill people without people, or instead of killing people without destroying buildings. Anyway, so that's pretty disturbing. There was two local academics mentioned in that article. One with a Middle Eastern name that I didn't mention in my post. The other one, who I'm familiar with, his name is Andreas Cangelaris, who is actually the head of the engineering program and is actually vying to be provost. One of the people being interviewed to be provost, and these things should be responded to. I guess I was just in the mood to get upset about something this morning. And the last thing I'll mention, just to throw it to you, is the business in Las Vegas. I'm not, of course I'm gruesomely fascinated by it, probably as much by the fact that this fellow was rich and spun out in strange ways, and by the fact that he seemed to follow in his father's footsteps, even though he didn't know his father or barely knew his father. Kind of a strange psychological, generational process there that we could ask about. But of course, what people have been appropriately talking about is guns and the role of guns. And I think Jeffrey St. Clair's column this morning, even though there's a lot that's said that's probably not worth reading, that's of a very speculative nature, I think what he said this morning in his column is very much worth reading in terms of speculating about our militarism and our guns and I would add to that sort of the casino culture, the culture of using money to make money and what it does to people's heads, because so much of what people do in this country to get rich obviously isn't very personally satisfying to them. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, David. That was, unfortunately, an impressive list because there are a lot of things there that are in the present American political lexicon deplorable. Deplorable indeed. And I agree with you also that the best single comment I've seen on the mass murder in Las Vegas was Jeffrey Sinclair's column this morning, and I'm almost thinking that before the end of the hour we might want to go back and look at that column at some length, because he does bring together a lot of the things that concern us here and that were indeed involved, I think, in this mass murder in Las Vegas. What I would like to do is turn to the general craziness that's occupying American politics right now, the Russiagate nonsense, and propose a brief article from another unlikely source. That is the Spectator journal in England, in Britain. The Spectator is an old line conservative, not neocon, but conservative publication. It's been around since the mid-19th century. It's recently been involved with some very questionable associates, including the newspaper The Daily Telegraph, which basically owns it these days, although it's an independent publication. So independent it was able to make the unlikely Boris Johnson its editor for a while, until he became British foreign minister under the present Conservative government. This is the depths to which the Spectator has sunk. So it's even more surprising that they've had one of the best articles that I have seen recently on Russian politics, and at least by implication, they're very chary about calling things by their right name. The American involvement with Russia, the American war with Russia that's going on in Syria right now. Syria is the stage on which this particular drama is being played out, and it's the point at which this article, as I say, from this conservative publication, begins, and it manages to produce a much more sensible account than we're getting from the American press on both Syria and Russia. When Russia entered the Syrian civil war in September 2015, the then U.S. Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, predicted catastrophe for the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin was, quote, pouring gasoline on the fire of the conflict. Now remember, the fire was started basically by the United States when the Obama administration hired jihadists, mad Islamic terrorists in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and elsewhere, and sent them into Syria to overthrow the Syrian government, just as more than a generation before, the Carter administration had done the same thing for the Afghan government in the 1970s. But when Russia stood up to defend Syria against the covert American attack, the American Defense Secretary, who knew perfectly well what the U.S. was doing in Syria, said that, of course, the Kremlin's exercise was doomed to failure. 2 years on, Putin has emerged triumphant, and Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, his future is secure. They will soon declare victory over ISIS inside the country. The war was ostensibly, and to some degree, in fact, against the Islamic State. The dismal failure turned out to be our cynical effort. Now, you might, sitting reading the Spectator magazine, wonder who are we? Who's the R referred to here? Interestingly and appropriately, it refers to the joint U.S.-UK Middle Eastern policy. The fact that the U.S. is the leader of this particular oxen yoke shouldn't surprise us. We remember that back to the Iraq invasion, Tony Blair was George Bush's poodle, and the poodle relationship continues. Dismal failure turned out to be the U.S.-UK cynical effort to install a Sunni regime in Damascus, that is Syria, by adopting the Afghanistan playbook from the 1980s. That is what the U.S. and the U.K. tried to do in Afghanistan in the 1980s. We would train, fund, and arm jihadis, foreign and domestic, in a partnership with the Gulf Arab despots, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. This way we would rob Russia of its only warm water naval base, Tartus, on Syria's Mediterranean coast. I think that was part of the geopolitical or the geostrategic concern of the U.S., that is, as it is regularly. But the larger one was, of course, the trembling up of Russian development, economic and political, in the world. In the process, we, that's US-UK again, would create a buffer between Iran and its Lebanon-based proxy, Hezbollah, to divide the anti-Israel Shia axis. A lot of problems here because of the way Hezbollah and Iran are presented in American news and political accounts, but we'll have to pass that for the moment. We would further marginalize Iran by extending the influence of our Sunni Gulf allies from Lebanon deeper into the Levant. Now, this account has it correct that the U.S. is involved in a division of the Middle East between our clients, allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, and our enemies, most notably Iran and that American policy over a generation and more can be seen as trying to sort that out, make clear who the enemies who the allies are, and reduce the enemies to the allied status. That's what the Iran nuclear deal is really about. 500,000 Syrians were slaughtered as a consequence of this harebrained scheme, whether it's harebrained or not, or deeply vicious, probably not a choice. 500,000 Syrians were slaughtered in this since 2011 in this American-produced Syrian civil war, which geopolitically has resulted in the exact opposite of its intended outcome. Putin, though, had grasped the opposite being the affirmation of the regimes in the Middle East that the U.S. wanted to destroy. Putin, though, had grasped the reality at the outset. Unlike Afghans, ordinary Syrians were used to living in a liberal, diverse culture that, while politically repressive, championed peaceful religious coexistence. Most of them were nervous about seeing their country transformed into a Wahhabi theocracy, Wahhabi being the right-wing Islamic tradition that dominates Saudi Arabia. Assad, the president of Syria, for all his faults, was a buffer between them and internecine carnage. They stuck with the devil they knew, and there was no popular revolution against Assad, nothing compared to the Tahrir uprising that ousted the hated Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak. The million-strong demonstration in Damascus were pro-regime. Among the two-thirds of the Syrian population now living in government-controlled parts of the country, Assad is more popular than ever, and Putin is a hero. Small wonder Putin recently mocked Washington for, quote, not knowing the difference between Austria and Australia, close quote. Putin really did say that, and it was based on a remark and goes back to the George Bush administration. But it does indeed characterize the, how shall we say, the propaganda ineptitude of American explanation of what it's doing in the region. The same charge could, alas, be leveled at NATO leaders in general. At a UN meeting last month, the Orwellian-named Friends of Syria group, with friends like this, you don't need enemies, right? The Orwellian-named Friends of Syria group, the Western and Gulf Arab alliance that unleashed jihad, stated they would not engage in reconstruction efforts until, in Boris Johnson's word, the British Foreign Secretary, there was a, quote, political move away from Assad. But weeks earlier, a massive international conference on reconstruction had taken place in Damascus. During it, Assad had ruled out awarding the multi-billion contracts up for grabs to hostile Western and Arab countries on the grounds that they had destroyed the country. Instead, Syria would look east, and especially to Russia, Iran, and China. Already Moscow is busy shipping thousands of tons of materials and more than 40 pieces of construction equipment, including bulldozers and cranes, to Syria, which does not want or need our assistance. An inability to acknowledge, still less confront, Russia's expanding regional role on the back of Syria was similarly highlighted during a whirlwind trip Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, made to Libya in August. There he had a brief meeting with secular strongman Khalifa Haftar, a former general in Gaddafi's army, whose forces now dominate eastern Libya, including Benghazi and most of the country's major oil fields. He is determined to overrun Tripoli and probably will. Haftar has ties with Moscow going back to the early 1970s and has been in Putin's pocket for at least 2 years, repeatedly meeting with Russian officials on an aircraft carrier off the Mediterranean coast. He's essentially Gaddafi's successor, Gaddafi having been sodomized with a bayonet by Hillary Clinton's agents and killed in the U.S. protection of Libya. A week before shaking hands with Johnson, Haftar had visited Moscow to hold extensive discussions with top officials from the defense and foreign ministries of Russia. They cemented plans to move fragmented Libya toward statehood under Haftar as an all-powerful defense minister with direct Russian military aid. The Kremlin has already deployed troops and fighter jets to western Egypt to join that country in the UAE, which is also backing Haftar in his unifying fight against the Islamists. The opponents of this restored Gaddafi regime in Libya are the very jihadis that the U.S. has been sponsoring sub rosa literally for years throughout the region. As with Syria for decades before the fall of Gaddafi, Russia was Libya's biggest arms supplier and closest international ally, and Moscow has long been eyeing a naval base in the Libyan coastline to complement its now much beef-up base in Tartus, that's in Syria. You can find these places on a map. It would be a worthwhile exercise because obviously the news media do not want to spend much time on the maps. Given all this, as Johnson suggested, the British Foreign Secretary suggested, that Haftar may have a role to play in any future political reconciliation while insisting that he abide by an internationally brokered ceasefire. The latter must have found it hard to contain his laughter. The situation, in other words, that the U.S., with the British poodle in following along, has produced now can't be overcome by the British Foreign Secretary going to Libya and saying nice things about the powers that have emerged there. Syria and Libya, though, are just two examples of how Russia is running rings around the West in its determination to achieve superpower status in the Middle East. Now, I said this was a conservative publication and so forth, and the notion that Russia's motive is to achieve superpower status in the Middle East is worth debate. It seems to me it's much more reasonable to see Russia as dealing with the fact that the destruction of its allies in the Middle East by jihadists is a direct threat to the Russian state. Look at a map once again and see how easy the transition from the Middle East to Russia itself would be for jihadists, and indeed has been so far. The Russian role in support of the legitimate government of Syria is much more defensive than is being suggested, certainly by that last remark by the Spectator. Putin has just inked a deal with Turkey, which has NATO's second largest standing army, to sell the latter its most advanced S-400 air defense system. The S-400 has already been deployed across Syria, while Iran has been given the less advanced but still formidable S-300. These are weapons systems, defensive weapon systems developed by Russia, and the need for them in the Middle East is obvious. Shortly after Russia entered the Syrian war, Turkey had shot down one of its planes. It was a deliberate attempt to provoke a wider war by President Recep Erdogan, who was furious that Putin was, by way of a relentless bombing campaign, putting an end to his support, Erdogan's support, Turkey's support, for ISIS foot soldiers inside Syria and its purchasing of oil from the caliphate. NATO had ignored all this duplicity in the hope that ISIS would weaken Assad. The U.S. and therefore NATO had been using ISIS and the jihadists in general against the government of Syria. It's testament to Putin's extraordinary diplomatic skills that Russia and Turkey are these days singing each other's praises as never before. And under Russian auspices, Turkey is working with Iran and Iraq to contain the fallout from the Kurdish referendum on independence. When King Salman of Saudi Arabia arrived in Moscow last week, it was the first time that a Saudi leader paid an official visit to Russia, but just the latest in more than 24 face-to-face meetings Putin has had with Middle Eastern leaders. Russia, of course, is not the Soviet Union, and it's easy to see why the Saudi and other Gulf tyrannies believe they can do business with an authoritarian leader like Putin. He shares their contempt for Western-style democracy. As I said, this is a conservative publication, and I don't think one has to buy that entirely to see why Saudi Arabia, which has become America's chief client after Israel in the region, would want also to try to have reasonable relations with Russia if they're on offer. Unlike whoever happens to inhabit the White House, he is a man of his word. That is Putin, promotes stability, not chaos, and has no complicating human rights agenda. That's a strange way to put a description of American propaganda. On the Saudi agenda in Moscow, the rise of Iran as a dominant regional player, Syria's de-escalation zones, and billions of dollars in Russian arms sales and direct mutual economic investment. Riyadh, that is Saudi Arabia, is still outraged that the Obama administration had agreed a nuclear deal with Iran, the Saudis' rival for regional hegemony, and is sulking over the Syria debacle. They have only Russia to turn to in an effort to limit Tehran's influence in Syria. Once again, complex because Russia is also obviously Tehran's backer, Iran's backer in the Middle East. For the same reason, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been holding meetings with Putin. During one, he was almost in tears as he, like the Saudis, begged the Russian leader to rein in Iran and Hezbollah, which seeks the Jewish state's destruction. That's once again the Israeli propaganda line. It seems very difficult to ascribe that motive to the Tehran government at the moment, as we talked about last week. In a desperate last-ditch effort to stop the Putin power grab in its tracks, the Trump administration will almost certainly decertify the Iranian nuclear deal on October 15th, despite the International Atomic Energy Agency, EU, and UN being adamant that Tehran is abiding by its terms. Now, that's interesting. I'd almost like to make a little book on that right now. I think I actually could do fairly well on that. I don't think the Trump administration will decertify this Iranian nuclear deal on the 15th of October. But if they do, they will do it in such a way the deal will continue to the satisfaction of the European allies and indeed Iran itself. I don't think the U.S. is going to back out of it for various reasons, in spite of what Donald Trump may bloviate about on the 15th of October.
Apparently it was reported this morning that he was going to decertify it.
It's being reported all over. As I'm saying, if he does, I'll be surprised, but if he does, my suggestion is it'll be in a fashion that will be giving with the left hand what the right hand takes back. So we'll talk about this next week. It's an important issue, but I think the overriding concerns of the U.S. with Iran and the Middle East are so great that a real rejection of the Iranian nuclear deal is not in the interest of the American government, to say nothing of the rest of humanity. The aim of some, certainly in the American government, some neocons in the American government and others elsewhere, the aim is to provoke military confrontation with Iran, or at least create more regional turmoil to undermine the Kremlin. That's certainly true. There are a lot of people in Washington who think and talk that way, and that's the reason that decertification is being bruited about. The reckless and unjustified move will throw a spanner in the works. Wonderful English phrase for screwing up the operation, but in the long term is, like intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, doomed to failure. Putin is well ahead of the curve, having pulled off the seemingly impossible diplomatic feat of fighting alongside Hezbollah in Syria while allowing Israel to bomb Hezbollah and Syria regime targets inside the country. Once again, I think this is wrongly stated, or overstated. It's not exactly what's going on in terms of the Russian support for Hezbollah. Last week, a delegation for the Palestinian terror outfit Hamas, I told you it's a British conservative publication, a delegation from Hamas visited Moscow for talks on the peace process after reconciling with arch-rival Fatah following yet another successful direct intervention by Putin. Look what's going on here, huh? And Netanyahu has been told that although Russia considers Israel an important partner, Iran will, come what may, remain its indispensable ally. Now that's right, and that's important, and that's the thing that conservatives and liberals in this country and Britain don't see. This is what Russia is doing. Putin might therefore already have the diplomatic leverage needed to diffuse tensions between Iran and Israel, well, once again leaving Washington sidelined and humiliated. For while the consequences of Netanyahu beating the war drums over Iran used to be non-existent, now Moscow could give the green light to battle-hardened Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah to unleash hellfire against the Jewish state. Once again, rather dramatically overstated, but the notion of the Russian support and its importance for the Middle East, that's right. It's easy to understand why Netanyahu is quaking in his boots. Well, but should we in Europe be alarmed at Putin's Middle East triumph? Not unduly so. You do not have to be a Putin groupie to acknowledge that it isn't him who's been launching one illegal invasion after another in the region, leaving millions dead, maimed, and displaced. No, of course not. It's the United States. And he's not only stemmed the flow of Syrian refugees into our continent, Europe, but started to reverse the trend. 500,000 Syrians have returned to their country this year alone after the Russian-Syrian alliance. And while no one side has emerged with their hands clean from one of the most brutal civil wars in modern history, it's also hugely heartening that there are so few defections from a Syrian army overwhelmingly made up of Sunni Muslims, 80% by some accounts. They were battling against myriad Sunni jihadi groups in the name of an Alawite-dominated empire. Assad, the president of Syria, is not a Sunni, he's an Alawite. Alongside Russian soldiers appalled, unlike us, by the carnage unleashed against their fellow Christians, as well as hardline Shia militias sent by Iran and Hezbollah, likewise determined to protect their own sects. Given how Tunisia and Turkey, the two historically secular Muslim countries in the region, are fast embracing Islamism, and how Sunni-Shia infighting continues to tear apart much of the rest of the Middle East, the victory of pluralism and secularism over the wicked Wahhabi jihad in Syria is ultimately uplifting. And not to put too fine a point on it, that victory is a result of Russia's intervention, and the wicked Wahhabi jihad was the creation of the Obama administration. So this is as I say, in spite of a few ideological hiccups in this account, this is a much more accurate description of the potential and actually existing Russian-American conflict in the Mideast than most anything you'll see in an American publication. Okay, more time perhaps spent on that than advertised, but it seems to me that the story is so badly told in this country right now, not just including Russiagate, but also the whole Syrian story, that it's worthwhile to have some corrective. You're watching News from Neptune, and David, have a crack at it.
Well, first thing is that the New York Times gave space to a horrible neoconservative woman named Danielle Placa on this morning's op-ed page to fulminate against Iran. What do you suppose the New York Times motives are in providing that kind of? I mean, she's just awful, and you would think that the New York Times, if they allegedly oppose Trump's overturning Obama's Iran deal, why are they giving space to Danielle Placa to make all the usual horrible, scurrilous statements about Iran?
Well, in a nutshell, the American policy remains really what it's been for generations, which is to delimit Russian economic integration and expansion into the world at large. Similarly with China, particularly since China and Russia have reached an entente on their economic and political integration. The U.S. is long been opposed to this sort of potential competition with the worldwide economic hegemony of the United States. Anything we can do to control Eurasia, particularly Russia and China, has been an American policy from the beginning. Now, the particular case of Iran comes from the fact that the U.S. attempt to control Iran went badly wrong when the Iranians threw out the government that the U.S. had picked out for them and established their independence in 1980. The U.S. attempt to reduce Iran has continued ever since, and Iran's alliance with Russia and China produces nightmares in Washington. They want to stop that any way possible. The Obama administration did this in a fairly sophisticated fashion by saying, okay, we'll do a deal with the Iranians that gets Iran back into the general economic and political organization, the overall framework of order, as Henry Kissinger said, that the U.S. supports in the Middle East. That's the reason for the so-called Iranian nuke deal, which had very little to do with nukes, and that's the reason that there are strong elements in Washington who say that no, it's a mistake to trash that deal. And why I'm willing to bet, as I say, that they won't trash it finally.
So
They'll keep up with it.
Just to get back to the New York Times, I haven't really kept that close an eye on their official editorial policy. I assume they oppose, I assume that they support continuing with the Iran deal.
That's what they've done until fairly recently.
So are they just being sort of, well, we'll give space to the American Enterprise Institute, we'll give space to a neocon just to sort of keep the debate, keep the sides of this debate clear, even though we don't support that. But there's lots of things they could have published besides Danielle Placa to enlighten, supposedly enlighten people about what's going on there. But again, it's the New York Times. I understand. I'm not being naive about this. I mean, they've hired all these conservative columnists, Bret Stephens and so forth, rather than hiring anyone from the quote-unquote real left, to which is completely absent pretty much from the New York Times editorial pages.
And just one more comment on the time. I think we have to make a distinction here between strategy and tactics. The strategy of the United States in opposing Russia's successful support for Syria, Russia's involvement in the Middle East, and indeed the economic integration of Russia itself, that strategy remains the same and really has been that way for generations. The tactics, how precisely to do it, that is a matter of debate. The Obama administration chose a fairly sophisticated tactic by setting up this nuke deal with Iran. There are others in Washington who, while down with the overall strategy, wonder whether this is the right tactic. And that's the argument we're seeing, perhaps even in the editorial chambers of the New York Times.
I also wanted to, you did refer in that article to or subsequent to that article, of the attempts at reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. Right. And I had wanted to actually correct a misstatement I made either last week on this program or perhaps at our teach-in, sort of because I was a little behind in terms of understanding that Hamas had more or less fallen out of favor with, according to people analyzing why it is that Hamas and Fatah are now meeting with each other, and that Hamas is kind of giving up the ghost of trying to have its own independent policy over Fatah, Hamas being centered in Gaza, that they no longer can rely on Hezbollah or Syria or Iran, because apparently Hamas has offended them in relation to its policies about Syria, or something in that relation has kind of weakened their dependence or their reliance on the axis of evil, on the kind of Shia axis of evil, in putting that in quotes, in the Middle East. So they're turning to Fatah, and then that's going to create different political choices regarding Israel, regarding U.S. foreign policy. And meanwhile, just to complicate this a little further, I know it's overwhelming, the Kurds, how about the Kurds?
The Kurds,
their
no way.
election,
Sure.
Yes, right. They're being, and Jonathan Cook, the British journalist who's headquartered in Israel and writes about Israeli issues, has written about Israel's relationship with the Kurds, supporting the referendum that the Kurds recently have, Israel apparently, whose policy has become to support among apparently singularly, according to Jonathan Cook, supporting something that the major powers pretty much uniformly don't want, is that a genuine independence, as opposed to this sort of de facto, independence that Iraqi Kurdistan now has. So Israel is busy doing a lot of calculations. Fatah and Hamas are busy doing a lot of calculations, and the Kurds at the same time. So there's a lot for American policymakers to consider this time at this time, and as the alleged peace process in Israel-Palestine, for instance, moves probably doesn't move forward, but they'll still call it the peace process.
I think part of the problem of understanding the Kurdish involvement with the politics of the Middle East is there are so many different Kurds that when the Kurds are being spoken of in the American mass media, we usually mean the statelet that occupies the northern part of Iraq and is been really quite comfortable with the governments of both Iraq and Israel, interestingly enough. The other Kurds make up of various groups, various leftish groups in western Kurdistan, as it's called, Rojava, which is in Syria. And the Syrian Kurds have their own peculiar relationship with the groups we've been talking about, in that as part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, they've been sponsored by the American military and are moving against the jihadists in Syria with the support of American air power. So there are various parties here involved with various political goals, and simple statements like the Kurds favor Israel, really, such as I just made, should be avoided.
Yeah, and I think it's important to clarify, if I'm correct, that the people that the Syrian Kurds are fighting, the jihadists, are basically ISIS, not necessarily the other jihadist groups.
Even this isn't
eastern Syria.
That's true.
So I don't know. I mean, for what that's worth, there's a lot of one of the prior. I read the Angry Arab blog, as I mentioned, once in a while on this program, and he has a sort of, I put a certain amount of stock in the Angry Arab's instincts around leadership in the Middle East, of which he's almost uniformly cynical about. One of whom is the Iraqi Kurdish leader Barzani, who he just feels is somebody who's just without lacking any principle of any kind. Not that it makes him any different from leaders of any other country. And also this week, apparently, there was the death of a previous Kurdish leader, Talabani. And the
interesting name.
The Angry Arab also had some choice words about him also, I think. So even though, the Kurdish cause, especially within Turkey, of course, has been to be utterly oppressed, and Noam Chomsky has been involved in defending the Kurds in Turkey over the decades, it's a complicated issue. And to sort of connect that to the whole issue of people wanting to be independent and establish their own states, whether it's Barcelona or Scotland or what else is on the California? Every time I see Catalonia, I kind of see California sometimes, so it's like the issue.
I see Catatonia.
Yeah, right. Or just Brexit. Beyond the Scottish independence move, just Brexit or other movements within Europe, in relation to the European Union. These are always very complicated issues in regards to whose interests are really going to be. I mean, the instincts always say, Catalonia, go for it, and sort of they're being treated horribly, obviously, by the Spanish government, but that doesn't necessarily help you understand in whose interests Catalonian independence is going to be, sort of neoliberal, economic-wise.
Right.
It's much more complicated than all that. Just as Brexit itself is much more complicated than all that. And I think Corbyn, as I mentioned before, is sort of trying to navigate what kind of Brexit it's going to be.
I was happy to see Jeremy Corbyn, who will probably be the next Prime Minister of Britain, the UK, say at the Momentum conference. Momentum was the group within the Labour Party that supported Corbyn's move to become head of the Labour Party. They had a conference recently in which Corbyn spoke and said as follows: "If we believe in socialism, let's set an example." Now, this is very interesting talk. I mean, it's far beyond the socialism of Bernie Sanders, for example. And Corbyn continues to be remarkably clear on matters of this sort. And you don't get too good a picture of what the forces actually are, even within Britain, from the American media. We don't, although there are all sorts of parallels, as you suggest, we don't see those parallels well set out because the accounts of the political forces in this country that we get from mainstream media are themselves so peculiarly twisted. Only deplorables voted for Trump, right? Well, if you believe this sort of account, it's very hard to see what's going on elsewhere when what's going on there looks like what's going on here.
And what Corbyn is proposing, again referencing what I spoke about at the start of the program, he's basically saying those things that the government should be running and owning is what it should be doing.
Exactly.
Taking out of the realm of exchange value and simply paying for the things that need to be done in a way that's affordable to people, whether it's transportation, electricity, water, and of course the National Health Service, which has been sort of gotten very frayed, to say the least, since the Thatcher era. That once you start to privatize things, then that becomes a problem, and then the resources devoted to the national project become less, and then people complaining about it. And that's the way neoliberalism works. It starts to privatize the privatization, austerity, and all of a sudden, the government can't take care of the National Health Service, when in fact Britain had a very well-functioning National Health Service, and Corbyn is very clear about getting rid of the privatized aspects of that and creating the kind of social solidarity that you have when everyone's committed and the government's committed and profits are not involved in that.
And this is an area in which the peculiar ignorance that is inculcated by the American media and indeed by the American Academy of recent history comes into play. Mm-hmm. Most Americans don't realize that at the end of the Second World War, the British people rapidly turfed out the old war criminal and racist Winston Churchill. In America, Winston Churchill is seen as this great hero who stopped Hitler. That's nonsense, of course. He wasn't and he didn't. But the image works in America, and we don't realize that the overt hostility to the conservatives that Churchill represented exploded after the war, and the British Labour Party won control of the government in an extremely class-divided society, and instituted these remarkable changes that produce things like the National Health Service, far beyond the sorts of things that even the most advanced Democrats who are talking about single-payer health care in the U.S. are talking about now, and it was 1946. Yeah. So the fact that Britain did this, and that the recent history of Britain has been, as you say, a neoliberal confiscation of those social gains that peaked with the Thatcher years, or didn't peak then because it's going on since, was founded by the Thatcher years, and the attempt to recapture the sort of social supports that the British people instituted for themselves after the ruinous Second World War is the sorts of things Jeremy Corbyn, Jezza, as they call him, Corbyn, is speaking for right now, and looks like triumphing in spite of the tremendous attempt of British conservatives, a British neoliberal business to to stifle this.
Yeah.
The jury's out.
Yeah, and part of this, of course, it was provoked by the fire at Grenfell Towers, just to kind of put an unfortunately tragic point on what privatization actually means in relation to housing. But there's been a lot of organizing around that in response to that, and I think, as I always mention, the Real News Network has done a good job of covering that. They've tapped into a British consortium called the Real Media, and so you'll find some of their interviews with various British activists, which are well worth watching on the Real News website. But also to conclude with, again, getting back to what we were talking about at the start, John Pilger's much more qualified assessment of Jeremy Corbyn on the Counterpunch website this morning, mainly in terms of Corbyn's foreign policy. He thinks Corbyn is being a little too Sanders-ish in terms of that, and that gets back to Britain after World War II. Whatever good was going on in Britain after World War II, they were already in the fold in supporting U.S. foreign policy. And I saw a reference in the last couple of days to British support for the Japanese reasserting their authority in Vietnam or Southeast Asia after World War II, and then handing it over to the French. So there was nothing that played out in terms of foreign policy that was similar to what was going on in Britain in terms of the establishment of the National Health Service. And of course, that was obviously being driven by the Americans at that time, by Truman and the Cold War that was being established at that time.
There's a lot of blood over the dam, so to speak, in American history and British history as well. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 40th week of 2017, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are available on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. There's a link to that from the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Do be aware, if you're watching this on Friday night, that there's a demonstration in downtown Champaign against the war at 2 p.m., from 2 to 4 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.